What if I told you Marilyn Manson was falsely blamed for one of the worst tragedies in American history, and the media knew the truth? In just a few days, one of the most recognizable rock stars in the world went from selling out arenas to being branded the villain in a national nightmare. Face was everywhere: TV screens, magazine covers, newspapers, next to words like evil, corrupting, dangerous to America's youth. Politicians, talk show hosts, and religious leaders lined up to condemn him, and they didn't care. There was no evidence. The people who carried out the attack weren't even fans. They didn't own his records, they didn't go to his concerts, and in private conversations, they'd even insulted his music. But that didn't matter because Manson looked like the kind of person the public could believe was guilty. The late 1990s were already a breeding ground for moral panic. Parents feared video games, heavy metal, and anything with a parental advisory sticker. Politicians were happy to use those fears to score points. And Manson, with his pale makeup, confrontational stage shows, and lyrics that openly challenged religion, government, and authority, was an easy target. Within days, he wasn't just a controversial musician anymore. He was the cause of a national nightmare, according to the headlines. Concerts were canceled, sponsors walked away, death threats flooded in. But what came next is the part the media didn't expect. Because instead of disappearing, Marilyn Manson fought back, and what he said in his defense became one of the most famous responses in music history. The tragedy had barely sunk in when the first wave hit. News outlets were scrambling to fill airtime. They replayed shaky footage of the school over and over, paired with speculation from anyone willing to talk. Reporters pieced together rumors from classmates, neighbors, and half-heard conversations. And in that chaos, one dangerous idea started spreading. The attackers were part of something called the Trenchcoat Mafia, and they were Marilyn Manson fans. It was a perfect headline. 2 words, Manson and murder linked together, were enough to guarantee outrage. And outrage in the news business meant ratings. Within hours, local gossip turned into national fact. Big-name TV anchors spoke as if the connection was confirmed. Pundits played grainy concert footage of Manson screaming into a microphone, slowed down just enough to make him look even more sinister. Past interviews were pulled out of context, edited into sound bites that stripped away his sarcasm or nuance. Magazine covers went even further. One put his pale, wide-eyed face next to the word killer. Another claimed the attackers worshipped him, despite police not even finishing their initial interviews. Protesters mobilized almost instantly. Outside venues, church groups prayed in circles while holding signs, "Ban this sick filth," and "Protect our kids." Parents called in to radio stations demanding his music be removed from stores. Politicians sensed the moment and jumped in, each trying to outdo the other in condemning Manson. Michigan State Senator Dale Sugars even attended one of Manson's shows to investigate, later describing it in sensational detail to the press. He painted a picture of satanic imagery, burning crosses, and crowds under Manson's control. His words made headlines across the country. The problem? Almost none of these early claims were based on fact. The shooters weren't Manson fans. They didn't own his CDs. They had never been to one of his concerts. But once the story was out, the truth didn't matter. This was no longer about investigating a tragedy. It was about finding a villain the public could see, hear, and hate. And for the media, Marilyn Manson was perfect. From the outside, it looked like the case was closed. Television panels nodded in agreement. Newspaper columns repeated the same accusations. And to the average viewer, it seemed obvious. The attackers were inspired by Marilyn Manson. But behind the cameras, the real investigation was telling a completely different story. When police combed through the attackers' homes, they cataloged everything: music collections, clothing, journals, computer files. What they found made it clear Manson wasn't there. No CDs, no posters, no ticket stubs, not even casual mentions in their writings. In fact, reports later revealed the shooters mocked Manson's music in private. They saw his style as something they didn't relate to at all. The evidence the media clung to, that they dressed like Manson, that they listened to his songs, was nothing more than rumor. But by the time law enforcement debunked these claims, the story had already taken root in the public's mind. Here's how it worked. A rumor started in a hallway interview or in a neighbor's recollection. A local reporter put it on air as early information. National outlets picked it up as fact. Politicians repeated it. And then it was quoted by even bigger outlets as if it came from an official report. By the time the police denied it, the truth wasn't breaking news anymore. It was buried on page 12. This is how moral panics are born. When a tragedy is too big and too complex to understand immediately, the easiest path is to find a single villain and build the narrative around them. It doesn't matter if the villain is actually responsible, only that they fit the role in the public imagination. And Manson fit that role perfectly for the late 1990s. He looked like trouble. His lyrics were confrontational. His concerts were theatrical, chaotic, and unnerving to those on the outside. To politicians and media executives, he was a gift, a real living symbol they could point to and say, "Here's the cause." The truth was simple. Marilyn Manson had no connection to the tragedy. None. But the lie was louder, and in the world of television, the loudest story wins. The damage didn't take months. It happened almost overnight. Manson's Rock is Dead tour, which had been pulling in massive crowds across North America, started collapsing. Entire shows were canceled within days. Venues that had been advertising his concerts suddenly announced they couldn't accommodate him anymore. Some promoters blamed security concerns. Others simply said it wasn't the right time for a show like his. The cancellations didn't just hurt Manson. Hundreds of people, from lighting techs to road crew, drivers, sound engineers, saw their pay vanish. Merchandise vendors lost orders. Local stagehands lost work. Every missed show meant another ripple of lost income for dozens of families. Sponsors and business partners bailed too. Record stores quietly moved his albums off the front shelves or stopped carrying them altogether. Retail chains that had happily sold his CDs for years decided it was bad optics to be associated with him. And then came the personal cost. The media's demonization made him a target. Death threats began pouring in. Not the kind of angry fan mail artists get, but explicit threats to kill him. Security at his home had to be increased. His team had to vet every person who came near him at a public event. Friends in the industry pulled away. Artists who once praised him stopped returning calls. Even some collaborators went quiet, afraid that any association could hurt their own careers. The isolation was real, not just professionally, but personally. All of this was happening at what should have been the height of Manson's career. His 1996 album, Antichrist Superstar, had gone platinum. Mechanical Animals debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts in 1998. He was, without question, one of the most recognizable names in rock. But now, every TV segment, every newspaper column, every radio discussion painted him as a corrupting force in American culture. It was a public execution without a trial. No jury, no verdict, just a guilty sentence handed down by the court of public opinion. And yet, even in the middle of the storm, Manson wasn't finished. The man who had built a career on provocation and spectacle was about to make his most famous move, not on stage, but in front of a camera, sitting quietly in a chair. The media expected Marilyn Manson to lash out. They expected profanity, anger, maybe even more theatrics, the kind of reaction that could be clipped and replayed as proof that he was exactly the monster they'd painted him to be. But instead, Manson went quiet. For weeks, he refused to do interviews. He didn't rush onto talk shows or news panels to defend himself. To the press, it looked like silence. To Manson, it was strategy. He knew that in the middle of a moral panic, anything he said in those first days would be twisted. So he waited. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to shout. It was to dismantle the entire argument against him. That moment came in a conversation that would later be immortalized in Michael Moore's documentary Bowling for Columbine. Sitting calmly, Manson was asked a simple but powerful question. What would you say to the kids at Columbine, the people in the community, if they were here right now? His answer wasn't what anyone expected. I wouldn't say a single word to them. I would listen to what they have to say. And that's what no one did. It was a line that cut through months of noise. In just one sentence, he exposed the truth. While politicians and news anchors were pointing fingers, no one had stopped to actually listen to the young people at the heart of the crisis. Manson didn't defend his lyrics or stage shows. He didn't try to win sympathy. He shifted the conversation away from himself and toward the real failures, leadership that ignored warning signs, a culture that rewarded sensationalism, and a media machine that needed a villain more than it needed the truth. For many viewers, it was the first time they saw Manson without the makeup, without the screaming, without the shock value, just a man speaking plainly. And in that moment, the so-called villain looked more rational and empathetic than the officials who had condemned him. It didn't erase the damage done to his career, but it cracked the narrative. The machine that had been so sure of his guilt now had to reckon with a version of Manson they couldn't easily dismiss. The accusations didn't vanish overnight. Even after the police reports cleared him, even after his own words undercut the media narrative, the stain remained. Some fans never returned. Certain venues quietly kept him off their booking lists. And in the eyes of many who only half remembered the story, Marilyn Manson would forever be tied to the tragedy. But something else happened too. Something his critics didn't plan for. Manson became a living example of what happens when fear replaces fact. Media studies classes began using his case as a textbook example of moral panic. When society faces a crisis, and the public, led by political and media voices, zeroes in on a convenient villain, the pattern was clear. Identify someone who looks or sounds dangerous, amplify their image in the public's mind, and blame them for problems they didn't cause. Other artists began citing his experience as a warning. From heavy metal bands to hip-hop icons, musicians who had been accused of corrupting youth pointed to Manson's story to show how quickly truth can be buried under sensational headlines. And Manson himself leaned into that role. In interviews, he would speak openly about being made into the folk devil, a term sociologists use for figures society demonizes to unite people against a common enemy. His later work, especially the album Holy Wood, In the Shadow of the Valley of Death, channeled the anger, isolation, and defiance that came from being scapegoated. He also sharpened his critique of the media. The same industry that vilified him had, in his view, helped create the very conditions it claimed to fight against. By glorifying violence in coverage, rewarding notoriety, and ignoring deeper societal issues. For his fans, surviving the smear campaign made him more than just a shock rock icon. He became a symbol of free expression, of resisting public shaming, and of refusing to change art to appease fear. The tragedy nearly ended his career, but the way he endured, and the way he used the experience to expose the machinery behind moral panic, became part of his legacy. They wanted Marilyn Manson gone, erased from the charts, erased from the stage, erased from the culture. For the media, he was the perfect scapegoat, theatrical, intimidating, unapologetic. For politicians, he was a distraction, a way to stand in front of cameras and promise action without confronting the deeper, harder truths. And for the public, already afraid and desperate for answers, he was easy to believe guilty. But he survived. He survived the headlines that branded him a murderer without evidence. He survived the canceled tours, the death threats, the friends who disappeared when things got too dangerous. He survived being turned into a villain in a tragedy he had nothing to do with. And in surviving, he did something the machine didn't expect. He exposed it. He showed how quickly fear can replace fact, how easily a rumor can become truth when repeated by enough voices, and how willing the powerful are to sacrifice someone's life and career if it means protecting their own image. Marilyn Manson didn't need to scream to make his point. In the end, all he had to do was sit in front of a camera and listen. They tried to bury him under a lie. Instead, they made him a symbol, not just of shock rock, but of free expression, and of what happens when a society chooses the easiest villain instead of facing the hardest questions. And maybe that's the real reason they couldn't erase him, because Marilyn Manson wasn't just fighting for himself. Whether they liked it or not, he was fighting for the right to speak, to create, and to be heard, even in the middle of the storm.